Days before Karsus began his fateful casting, on the enclave of Thultanthar, an arcanist named Telemont Tantal was conducting an experiment of his own. Telemont, known to his people as Lord Shadow, had long been fascinated by the Plane of Shadow, that dark mirror realm that the Netherese had discovered centuries earlier. He had studied its properties, mapped its geography, cataloged its inhabitants, and developed a deep understanding of the shadow magic that permeated its every aspect. And now, in the waning days of the Empire, with the Farum War grinding on and the future of Netheril increasingly uncertain, Telemont attempted something extraordinary. He shifted his entire enclave into the Plane of Shadow. The magical working was immense. Tultanthar was not a small city. It was a full-size flying enclave, home to tens of thousands of people, with all the infrastructure and magical systems that implied. Moving the entire structure from the material plane to the Plane of Shadow required magical energies that strained even Telemont's formidable abilities. But the spell worked. Tultanthar vanished from the sky above Netheril, fading from the material world like a dream dissolving in the light of morning, and reappeared in the Plane of Shadow. A dark, muted, half-real version of itself, floating above a dark, muted, half-real version of the landscape it had left behind. Telemont intended the shift to be temporary, a few weeks at most, a test of the technique's viability as a potential escape route if the Farum War turned catastrophic. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. While Thultanthar floated in the shadows, Karsus cast his spell. Mistral died, magic failed, and the flying cities of Netheril fell from the sky. In the Plane of Shadow, the effects were muted but unmistakable. The weave rippled and distorted. The mythalar of Thultanthar flickered, but it did not fail. The Plane of Shadow, being a separate dimension with its own relationship to magic, was partially insulated from the catastrophic weave disruption that devastated the material plane. Thultanthar survived. After several weeks, Telemont managed to shift the enclave back to the material plane, briefly, tentatively, just long enough to survey what had happened. What he found was devastation beyond imagining. The sky was empty. The other enclaves were gone, shattered, scattered, their ruins littering the landscape like the aftermath of a war between gods. The settlements of Low Netheril were abandoned or destroyed. The narrow sea was already beginning to shrink, and there were no other survivors, no other flying cities, no other arcanists of any significant power. Thultanthar, it seemed, was the last. Telemont considered his options. He could try to establish the enclave on the surface, building a new Netheril from the wreckage of the old. But a single city, even one as powerful as Thultanthar, could not hope to rebuild an empire. The Farum were still active beneath the surface. The resources were insufficient. The population was too small, and the new goddess of magic, Mystra, had imposed restrictions that would prevent the Netherese from ever regaining the level of magical power they had once wielded. Or he could retreat. Go back into the Plane of Shadow. Wait, build strength, prepare, and return when the time was right, when Thultanthar was strong enough to reclaim what had been lost. Telemont chose to retreat. He shifted Thultanthar back into the Plane of Shadow, this time with the intention of staying. He vowed to his people that they would one day return to Toril and re-establish the Empire of Magic. It was a promise made in grief and rage and desperate hope, and it would take 1,700 years to fulfill. The clerics of Shar aboard Thultanthar cast divinations to determine the true cause of the catastrophe. What they learned, that the destruction had been caused not by the Farum, but by a fellow Netherese arcanist, a man named Karsus, who had tried to steal the power of a goddess, was communicated only to the nobility. The common people of Thultanthar were allowed to believe that the Farum had destroyed their civilization. This deception, presumably orchestrated at the behest of Shar herself, served the dark goddess's purposes in ways that would not become clear for centuries. And so Thultanthar floated in the shadows, and the centuries passed. Life in the Plane of Shadow was not easy. The realm was hostile, a place of perpetual twilight, muted colors, and distorted geography, where familiar landmarks existed in twisted, half-recognizable forms. The native inhabitants were dangerous. The Malagrim, shape-shifting creatures of considerable power, waged constant war against the Netherese interlopers, and the battles were costly. Other shadow creatures harassed the enclave, testing its defenses, probing for weaknesses. The citizens of Thultanthar lived in a state of constant vigilance, always fighting, always defending, always struggling to survive in a realm that seemed designed to devour them. But they adapted. They had to. And over the course of centuries, the adaptation went deeper than anyone had anticipated. The ambient energy of the plane of shadow, the shadow stuff as the arcanists called it, slowly but relentlessly altered the physiology and the very nature of Thultanthar's inhabitants. Their skin grew pale, then gray, then translucent, traced with dark veins that were visible beneath the surface. Their eyes changed, developing a quality that was simultaneously luminous and empty, as though they were looking at the world through a lens of darkness. Their hair darkened to black or bleached to white. Their bodies became thinner, more angular, more angular in ways that suggested the shadow was wearing away everything that was soft and human and leaving behind only hard edges and sharp angles. The ruling class, the nobility of Tultanthar, the arcanists and their families, underwent the most dramatic transformations. Through deliberate magical rituals, they learned to infuse themselves with shadow energy, becoming what were known as shades. Shades were beings who existed partially in the material plane and partially in the plane of shadow simultaneously. Creatures of darkness who could step between the two realms as easily as a normal person stepped from one room to another. They could melt into shadows, becoming invisible and intangible. They could draw upon the energy of the plane of shadow to fuel their magic, bypassing the weave entirely and using the shadow weave, a parallel magical network maintained by Shar herself, as an alternative source of power. The common people of Thultanthar underwent less dramatic but equally irreversible changes. They became the Shadovar, shadow-touched humans whose connection to the darkness was woven into their very being. They were not shades, not fully transformed, but they were no longer entirely human either. Their culture changed to match their transformed bodies. The bright, extravagant aesthetics of old Netheril gave way to dark robes and obsidian ornaments. The confident, outward-looking temperament of the Netherese was replaced by a guarded, secretive, inward-turning disposition. They became a people of whispers and shadows, of hidden agendas and carefully guarded secrets. And through it all, Shar's influence grew. The dark goddess of loss, secrets, and the night had found, in the displaced Netherese, a people perfectly suited to her purposes. They had lost everything. They were consumed by grief and anger. They were isolated, vulnerable, and desperate for any source of strength that could help them survive. Shar offered them the shadow. She offered them power. She offered them the promise that their exile was not permanent, that they would one day return and reclaim what was rightfully theirs. All she asked in return was their devotion. They gave it. 1,700 years is a long time by any measure. Empires rose and fell on the material plane, while Thultanthar drifted through the shadows. The time of troubles shook the heavens and reshaped the divine order. The spell plague rewrote the rules of magic yet again. Nations were born, grew old, and died. And through it all, the city of Shade endured, patient, calculating, preparing for the day when it would return. That day came on the 1st of Hammer in the year of wild magic, 1372 of the Dal Reckoning. Through a complex chain of events involving the elf Galaeran Nimadu and the shade prince Meligant Tantal, the spell that held Thultanthar in the plane of shadow was broken. The city materialized above the dire wood, the very place where Karsus's petrified body lay buried, and then drifted slowly over the Anorok Desert, the vast wasteland that had been the heartland of the old empire. The city of Shade had returned. Farron was not ready for what came out of the shadows. The Shadovar were alien, powerful, and utterly determined. They had spent 17 centuries preparing for this moment, and they had no intention of being denied. Almost immediately, the princes of Shade began searching for Nethere's ruins and artifacts, seeking to reclaim the power of their ancestors. They established diplomatic ties with some nations and launched covert operations against others. They infiltrated, manipulated, spied, sabotaged, and occasionally annihilated those who stood in their way. Their ultimate goal was breathtaking in its ambition, to restore the empire of Netheril. Not the old Netheril of golden light and flying cities, but a new Netheril, darker, harder, forged in shadow and dedicated to Shar. A Netheril that would never fall again because it would be sustained not by the weave, but by the shadow weave, not by the favor of Mistra, but by the blessing of Shar. It was a vision of empire rebuilt on the foundation of everything the old Netheril had done wrong. The arrogance, the hubris, the casual assumption that magical power conferred the right to rule. But the Shadovar could not see this. They saw only glory, only destiny, only the rightful inheritance of a people who had been wronged by fate and who were finally, after 17 centuries of darkness, coming home. The returned Netherrace Empire was, from its very first day, a threat to every nation in Faerun. And the story of how that threat was eventually destroyed, in a catastrophe that mirrored the original fall with almost poetic precision, is the final chapter of the story of Netheril.